My name is Pete Eberle. I'm with the Colorado Renewable Energy Society, or CRES, and I want to thank everyone for joining us here tonight. For those of you who are not familiar with CRES and our local chapters provide education, policy advocacy, and community engagement that accelerate Colorado towards a carbon neutral future powered by 100% renewable energy. Founded in 1996, CRES is a statewide, nonpartisan 501c3 not-for-profit that's supported by our individual sustaining members, our business sponsors, as well as donations and grants. If you go to cres-energy.org, www.cres-energy.org, you can sign up for our newsletter, social media, and make sure you get all the announcements for upcoming events. Also, make sure to check out our YouTube channel, where we will eventually publish this webinar, along with 200, and I think we're probably almost 260, we just added some today, previously recorded videos that have garnered over 1.4 million views. So before we get started, just a couple of upcoming events. Tuesday, October 22nd, 7 p.m. in Golden, Colorado at the Jefferson Unitarian Church. We'll have Whatever Happened to the Hydrogen Economy. This event will be hybrid, so you can go in person, or it will be live streamed as well. We'll have Chuck Kutcher, PhD, formerly of NCRES, now of CU Boulder, RACI, and also a member of the CRES Policy Committee, who's going to talk about the physics, practicality, and in some cases, where hydrogen makes sense, and in which industries are behind the hydrogen push. So kind of a pulse check on everything that's going on with hydrogen. There's a lot of hype, and we'll kind of cut through all of that during that presentation. So don't miss that one. Then on Thursday, November the 7th, 5 to 8 p.m. up in Fort Collins, where I am, we will have engineering, energy transportation, and innovation with C0. C0 is a local company that forms to help accelerate and do proof of concept for clean tech technologies. We're going to have a lot of networking for that. It'll be 5 to 8, and then we're going to have a little presentation and then tours of their facility. So if you're very much an engineering geek or like to see what's going on with emerging technologies, come up and join us for that on Thursday, November the 7th. And then on Wednesday, November the 13th, 6 p.m., we'll have an overview of the Colorado Geothermal Roadmap. That'll feature Bryce Carter, who's with the Colorado Energy Office and has been leading the Heat Beneath Our Feet initiative. And they did a big study, and they looked at the roadmap, and they also have a whole bunch of pilot projects looking out on everything geothermal, from ground source for individual homes, district ground source, as well as looking at what possibility exists to actually generate electricity. So that will be a webinar. Details on that will be forthcoming. I actually don't have it published yet. You can find out about these at cres-energy.org and go to the events tab. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the baton over to Eli Asher of LineVision Technologies. Also, quick note, Tim Stelzer won't be able to join us. He had an unfortunate conflict, but Eli will be able to carry on. All right, Eli, over to you.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Again, by way of introduction, my name is Eli Asher. I'm here with a company called LineVision. We are a provider of dynamic line ratings. You'll hear me go through a handful of acronyms today, which I'll try to explain. But before I get into the actual presentation materials, just some quick background about myself. I've been working in the energy policy space for close to a decade now. I started my career at the utility company Southern California Edison. I'm based in Los Angeles. I'm actually still based in Los Angeles, though LineVision does have one of our headquarters in the Boulder area. So I've been out to visit a couple of times and definitely a big fan. But in addition to working at a utility, I have experience on the consulting side of things, working for regulators, consumer advocates, and advocacy groups like yourself. And since then, I have joined LineVision. My role is as the regulatory and policy manager, and my focus is kind of mostly across the Western US. So with that, I will go ahead and dive in. So what are we here to discuss today? So as I mentioned, there's a couple of acronyms I'm going to throw your way, and I'll start with two. You'll see them both on the screen. We've got grid enhancing technologies, which refers to GETs, and dynamic line ratings, which refers to DLR. So DLR fits within the category of GETs. I will get to that in just one second. But generally, GETs are a type of technology that allows utilities to unlock the capacity of the existing grid today and also the future grid, and can improve the reliability, safety, and the efficiency of today's grid. So before I get into the technology itself, let me hit on a couple of kind of the key challenges we see facing the US transmission system, and a number of these are particularly notable in Colorado as well in particular. So first, let's start with grid expansion. The Department of Energy has stated through several reports that they anticipate a need to double the existing transmission capacity across the US grid by 2035. That's just 11 years away, and I'm not sure how much folks in this room might be transmission experts, but on average, it takes often 7, sometimes well north of 10 years to actually complete a transmission project. So if you're counting down the days till 2035, we are pretty close to that 10-year mark. There's going to be a major need for grid expansion, and that's an area where DLR can come into play. Second, there's a huge backlog of mostly clean energy projects sitting in interconnection queues across the US. Industry or regional organizations like CAISO and others like SPP, MISO are all looking at areas where they can streamline and modify the interconnection process. But right now there is a massive backlog. About 95% of the projects sitting in the queue are clean energy projects. And so we're really seeing transmission capacity as a key barrier in getting these new clean energy projects connected to the grid. Third, the US infrastructure is aging. Currently over 70% of all lines across the US are approaching the end of what's considered their useful life. For many transmission assets, that's about 50 years. And so we are, about 10 years away from needing to replace a very large number of assets in the US, regardless of growth and other underlying needs to replace those assets. They're just aging out. And then the fourth major challenge we see today is load growth. I don't know about the folks on this call, but in my role, I read a new article every day about data centers looking to interconnect in the US. And Colorado is a specific example where Xcel Energy has noted that they are seeing data center growth within their region. In addition to data centers, we've got electrification, both vehicles and buildings, and there's a significant push towards the reshoring of manufacturing in the U.S., and that's also spurring a lot of growth. Things like President Biden's CHIPS Act, for example, have really spurred a lot of economic growth in the U.S., which again is resulting in the need to accommodate those new loads with the electricity they need to serve their customers. And the last challenge I'll highlight is kind of an overarching challenge. This one shocks a lot of people, but close to 100% of all transmission lines across the US have no monitoring on those lines, so no current visibility as to how those lines are behaving. And that is where a lot of grid enhancing technologies come in. So as I mentioned, GETs, or grid enhancing technologies, it's kind of an umbrella term. There are 3 primary technologies that we consider as a GET, but these are all generally hardware or software solutions, some both, that increase the capacity, efficiency, or reliability of transmission facilities. So starting with dynamic line ratings, again, dynamic line ratings, or DLRs, that is the technology that LineVision produces. So DLRs are a measure of the true capacity of the transmission grid based on real-time and forecast conditions, primarily weather-related conditions. When I talk about DLR, an analogy that we typically use in the industry, and bear with me on all these analogies, I'm going to do them for all 3. We think of all related to traffic. So think of DLR kind of as adding an extra lane on a crowded highway overnight without really having to do any outage, any construction, etc. It's like it's taking, you know, what we have today and expanding the capacity of the grid, or in this case of the highway, to accommodate more energy or vehicles. So that's what dynamic line ratings are able to do. The next grid enhancing technology is advanced power flow control, or APFC. APFCs reroute power from congested areas of the grid over to underutilized areas of the grid. So think of APFCs kind of like a traffic cop, you know, sitting at a light when the light is otherwise out, pointing cars in the right direction to try to alleviate traffic. And then lastly, advanced topology control. This is a software solution that identifies ways to reconfigure the grid to more efficiently reroute power and move that power around those bottlenecks. So think of topology control, sometimes also called topology optimization. Think of that as your Google Maps or your Waze or whatever GPS system you use. It's, you know, kind of telling you the most efficient route. And not shockingly, you know, these three technologies work quite well in concert. Yes, they provide significant benefits on their own, but when taken all together, utilizing all of these technologies or utilizing two of the three technologies really exacerbates might be the wrong word, but really stretches the benefits of any of the one technologies. So again, DLRs are kind of like getting an extra lane on the highway without construction. Advanced power flow control is rerouting power, think of like at a traffic stop. And then topology control or optimization is kind of like your Google Maps telling you where to go. So we'll speak about LineVision's product specifically. So we utilize a sensor. This is a picture of it. You can see we stick the device right on a transmission tower, and we point it up at the transmission line. It's also called a conductor. And this sensor basically reads the real-time health of that line. So we can put this on any tower, any voltage, any conductor. The most typical range we see are 69 to 345 kV lines. And again, as I mentioned with the analogy, this requires no outages and importantly, no live line work. There are other DLR technologies different from ours that don't put the sensor on the tower. As you can see in the picture, we stick it on the tower. Some put the device right on the line. If you put it on the line, you have to de-energize the line. You have to do an outage on the line. Otherwise, it's quite dangerous to be operating on a live energized line. To give you, and then just to give you kind of like a more detailed picture, you can see in the top left, that's what our device looks like. All of the components are kind of inside that little box, and there's that solar panel right under it that helps helps power the battery that's inside that allows the device to operate. We have installed over 400 sensors globally, which has allowed over 1 gigawatt of renewable energy to be added to the grid, has saved over $55 million to customers across the world, and has alleviated the need for 1.2 million metric tons of CO2 that has been avoided that would otherwise have occurred. So where does GETS come in? GETS pairs well before construction, during construction, and importantly also after construction. So the way that we view GETS is these are tools that should be considered before a utility is going to go and either rebuild or reconductor a new line, which is more costly, or especially before they're going to build new transmission investment, they should explore GETS. Now, a common misnomer that I've heard out there is that some folks believe that folks within the GETS industry think that GETS are a panacea, that they will solve all of the transmission needs of the grid across the US. That is not true. Anyone that tells you that DLR or GETS on the whole will be able to solve all of the US's transmission needs over the coming years, it's an incorrect notion. The reality is that we're going to need all of the above. It needs to be a portfolio approach. So GETS will certainly be a part of the transmission build out, but new transmission infrastructure is going to be necessary. If we're going to, as I highlighted a couple slides ago, double the capacity of the transmission grid today, there's gonna need to be new investment. But before you get there, GETS can play a role before construction. So the primary use case we see is on congested lines. Congestion costs in the US in 2022, I want to say we're north of $20 billion. This is really where DLR comes into play. You can place DLR on a line, and as soon as it's the data that we get from these DLR systems are utilized by utilities, they can start identifying areas of the grid where they immediately can relieve congestion, meaning cheaper, more local solar power can get to your home instead of a utility having to turn on a gas peaker plant, for example. Next, we see GETS being very useful during construction. So as I mentioned, you can deploy GETS oftentimes without having to take out a line. Utilities typically operate the system under what's called an N-1 contingency, which means there's redundancy in the system. So a lot of, a very simplistic way to look at it is kind of there's often two lines that are doing the same thing, because if one fails, you need the other one to be operational. So what DLR can do when being deployed during construction, it can alleviate the need for a utility to de-energize a line, which could either mean a planned outage for customers or having to overload another line. We can alleviate the need to do that. That can result in a 40% reduction in outage-driven congestion costs. And then lastly, we can be paired with new investments after construction. We see, while the biggest capacity gain, typically around up to 40%, is before construction, even on a brand new transmission facility, transmission owners will see about a 16% increase in the utilization of those new lines. So imagine being able to get 16% more out of the new build investments when utilities are already going and investing billions of dollars in these transmission investments. A relatively small investment in DLR can get you even more out of that new build infrastructure. So DLR and GETS in general are highly complementary throughout kind of the entirety of the transmission infrastructure lifecycle. The last kind of, or one other area of benefits that I'll speak about. So the approach that we use to dynamic line ratings involves sensors. You saw it a couple of slides ago. So we put a sensor on the towers, and this sensor can deliver grid monitoring. Basically, we equip the equivalent of every circuit mile with some level of visibility through a sensor. Now, DLR can be accomplished with sensorless approaches, no sensor required. However, those approaches use numerical weather prediction models, and those are not hyper-local. We can actually stick a sensor right in the local area and kind of get those hyper-granular, that hyper-granular visibility to what's going on with the weather in that area. So because of that ability, DLR sensors have the ability to help mitigate wildfire threats and also improve the response to wildfires. So, I believe it was in Colorado. What was it? Or it was earlier this year, or maybe it was last year, that Colorado conducted its, I think it was this year, Colorado conducted its first public safety power shutoff, PSPS event. We understand that utilities only do these events when they feel that they absolutely have to. Otherwise, in situations where otherwise a fire could ignite on a line. So we understand that. However, PSPS events can either be called broadly over a large area, or they can be called in a more granular, kind of hyper-localized fashion. And DLR sensors have the ability to provide more, this more hyper-local weather, and then therefore can help detect fire, smoke, pollutants in the air, things that are indicative of a fire passing through an area, which can help determine For example, where a fire was started, how a fire was started, how it's likely to spread, which importantly can help a utility, figure out how to mitigate a PSPS event or reduce the the area of land that a PSPS event covers. And then it can also help utilities digitize their field operations, helping improve the ability to conduct remote inspections, being able to triage what happened in certain areas, and therefore sending less crews, real live people to these lines to inspect and make sure the lines are operable before they essentially re-energize them. So DLR sensors also, beyond just expanding the capacity of the grid, they can really help provide visibility and situational awareness to utilities beyond capabilities that they typically have today. Just a couple more slides before I stop for Q&A, so bear with me here. And I know this one is a bit text heavy, but we've already talked about the problem. The U.S. needs to double its transmission capacity by 2035. Congestion costs are high and mostly rising each year. GETs, as a solution, offer the ability to reduce that congestion and improve the efficiency and capacity of the grid. GETs can be an affordable bridge solution that can help defer or avoid investments. I'll show you on an upcoming slide, but GETs can have an incredibly fast payback period. They increase the visibility to the grid, improve operational flexibility and reliability, and as I mentioned, they can complement new transmission investments. And then lastly, they can also they're portable. They can be deployed where they're needed on the grid quickly and without outages. So if there's a situation where a utility determines they no longer need DLR in a specific area, they can move that sensor to another part of the grid and determine if that area now is experiencing congestion that they can then relieve through DLR. And then lastly, I'll just hit on some of the benefits. On average, we see a 30% capacity increase on existing lines when DLR is deployed. Now, I want to be clear that this is not always the case. You're not 100% of the time going to get 30% more capacity out of the line. DLR is entirely about the weather. In real time, how is the weather impacting the transmission grid? Just to put it very, very basically, when a transmission line, think of the line that's going over the highway on your drive to work. When it's hot outside, that line sags down. When it's cooler outside, that line is more taut. So it's relatively intuitive, but on hotter days where there's not a lot of cloud cover, your transmission line is going to sag. That is dangerous because it could touch another line that can spark a fire. It can touch vegetation that can also spark a fire. However, when you have kind of a windy day, for example, wind is the single biggest factor that can help cool a line. When a line is cool, it can pass through a lot more power. And so that's why this 30% increase that I'm referring to is not a static assumption. It's not always the case. These are DLRs, dynamic line ratings. So the idea being that about 95% of the time, a DLR will show that the grid has more capacity than what was previously assumed by the utility. But that does leave about 5% of the time where the rating of a line could actually go lower, meaning the utility was operating their line potentially at too high of a rating, which can cause clearance issues and also result in igniting fires. Over the long-term life of an asset, a lot of these assets are 50 years, running a line too hot can have these long-term impacts, and you're not going to see those the next day or even the next year, but over the course of a 50-year life cycle of an investment, that is going to have a negative impact on the health of that line and can cause issues down the road. So 30% uprate in capacity about 95% of the time. DLR can be up and running in about 3 months from approval. And then lastly, it costs a fraction of the cost of rebuilding or of building new transmission lines. about 5% of the cost of building new transmission lines. And then I think it's about 10 to 20% of the cost for reconductoring transmission lines. This slide highlights a couple of LineVision projects. I'll go through these quickly and not give you the details of each one, but in general, we have installed DLR at critical sections of various lines, which allows utilities to operate lines to their max efficiency and capacity. Speaking to a project in the Sacramento area with local utility SMUD, we proactively alleviated a bottleneck where they get really cheap hydropower to Sacramento. That makes up I think it's the biggest chunk of their energy portfolio is hydro, really cheap. And they were experiencing a bottleneck where that hydropower could not make its way over to Sacramento. And instead of having to turn on a gas peaker plant, for example, we were able to alleviate that constraint, and they were able to utilize significantly more hydro in their portfolio. In National Grid's territory in New York, we've got the first ever operational project in the US. Operational basically means the data from our system is being fed real time to the utility and to the New York Independent System Operator, and meaning they can then fully utilize DLR calculations within their planning. We also work with National Grid in the UK, where we save over 14 million pounds, not dollars, pounds, in annual congestion costs, which has reduced offshore wind curtailments in the UK. And then lastly, we deployed with utility AES in Indiana and Ohio, where a number of benefits were realized, increased capacity in most cases. And in the case of one line, we were actually able to identify an area where they were going to go and do about a $10 million upgrade project. And deploying DLR identified that it was a much smaller portion of the grid where their constraint was actually occurring. So instead of doing a $10 million upgrade project, they were able to do a $1 million upgrade project on a much smaller portion of the grid to then kind of alleviate that same concern. So again, DLR, small amount of costs, providing, or telling the utility that they can go and do a much smaller project that is about 10% of the cost that they would have otherwise incurred. Just a couple more slides and I'll be wrapping up. Relatively close to the Colorado footprint and in the SPP footprint specifically, there was a study conducted by consulting firm Brattle that showed the benefits of various GETs. So this looked at not just DLR, but the other GETs as well. Under the study, the Kansas and Oklahoma were able to double the amount of renewable energy that they were able to interconnect, I think from 2.6 gigawatts to 5.2 over the study period. The payback period of the investment was just 6 months. So again, just deferring or avoiding the need to do a transmission upgrade for a year would prove to be cost effective in this case. The project resulted in alleviating 3 million tons of CO2 emissions, resulted in $175 million in production cost savings just in the first year. And so those would be annual savings thereafter. And the cost of the entire project cost under $90 million. So a $90 million project resulting in $175 million in savings in just year one. The project also resulted in over 11,000 short-term jobs and 650 long-term jobs being created. And then as you can see, kind of if you were to extrapolate those results nationwide, it would save over $5 billion in costs annually, reduce emissions by 20 million metric tons annually, create tens of thousands of jobs, including long-term high-paying jobs, and then of course represent progress towards decarbonizing the grid. And then I think this is my last material slide. I know it's a text-heavy one, but I think this is going to be particularly pertinent for folks at CRES. GETs are gaining a lot of momentum, and that's why we're talking to folks like you all. So industry advocates really can play a huge role in ensuring utilities realize the benefits of GETs. You can advocate for requirements for utilities to evaluate GETs in integrated resource plans or transmission planning proceedings, requiring utilities to include the various benefit streams of transmission or of GETs within their IRPs, essentially improving cost-benefit analysis processes, requiring energy offices or state transmission authorities, which there is one in Colorado, to study GETS implementation. Also encouraging utilities or regulators to explore incentive mechanisms that can ensure not just ratepayers make money, but actually incentivize the utility to make money by deploying GETS as well. And I can get more into that and show you how it can kind of be, ensure utilities only get an incentive if it represents a win-win-win situation where customers are actually determined to have saved money by the utility deploying that GETS investment. And then lastly, looking at energy efficiency or otherwise congestion standards that can help ensure that when the system reaches, an efficiency cap or hits a certain point of congestion, GETS are brought in as a relief mechanism. So pointing to a few states, 2023 and 24 were really big years for GETS legislation. I think we've had 5 bills approved in legislative cycles this year. I work in the regulatory and policy space, and so I've heard of rumblings of other bills coming in the 2025 session. Colorado actually did a good job with Senate Bill 23016, which was introduced by Senator Hansen, which required CETA, the state transmission authority, to study how to maximize the existing grid. Now, the study fell short of truly including GETS. They've been giving presentations about the study over the last couple of months. The study is not fully out yet, but should be in the coming weeks. So this is something we're reviewing to better understand why kind of GETS didn't meet the mark within the study. But there's also potentially an opportunity, and I know the CETA board is considering how to actually reconduct that study on an ongoing basis to make sure it does include GETS in the future. And then on the federal side, states and utilities have won a ton of GRIP funding that will result in the largest deployments of GETS to date. Actually, today, some new funding was just announced. Our company did win a project deploying DLR with the utility Southern Company in the Southeast. And then FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has required that GETS be incorporated into any long-term transmission planning processes as part of its orders 2023 and most recently Order 1920. And then also FERC is considering a separate mandate that would require utilities to deploy DLR under certain circumstances. And then lastly, the White House, along with 22 states, including Colorado, have committed to upgrading 100,000 miles of conductors in the US with GETS or advanced conductors. So all of these commitments really underscore that GETS are gaining a lot of momentum. But at the end of the day, it will kind of come down to ensuring they are actually truly deployed. The reality is that utilities, with the way that they make money today, are not typically incentivized to deploy GETS, and therefore they've done so more on a pilot scale than at full scale. And so it's really up to folks, to you all at NCRES, to regulators, to lawmakers, to really ensure that utilities are doing what their customers are asking for, which is making sure the grid is not just reliable and resilient, but affordable. And without an affordable grid, we're already likely to see electricity costs significantly rising in the coming years. I was just reading that Xcel already has a higher price tag on I think it's its clean energy plan than they're already assuming increased supply costs of about 20% from what was proposed just a year ago. And so, we're going to unfortunately likely see electricity costs rising. And instead of them rising a hell of a lot more with only new build transmission infrastructure, GETS will play a key role in making sure we can reduce the cost of expanding the grid by getting more out of the system that we have today. And with that, I will pause, and I'm happy to take any comments or questions.
Well, Eli, thanks. Let's get to work here. Utilities say there is no role for DLR in transmission, but only in operations because the extra capacity is not firm. Do you agree? And if not, how can DLR be used in transmission planning? This is very relevant in Colorado right now because the transmission planning rulemaking is imminent and advanced transmission technologies are on the agenda.
Yes, great question. I will add I am closely tracking the transmission planning proceeding at the PUC. We will be participating in that and advocating. And so thank you for the question. It's a really good one and it's a tough one. We see this pushback a lot. You know, utilities are historically hesitant to use any new technologies generally, right? It typically takes utilities longer than the average other industry to start incorporating new technologies into their day-to-day work. And so there's inherently that hesitancy. But aside from the hesitancy itself, what we see as the big barrier to getting utilities to utilize DLR in planning is purchasing it and starting to use it for anything, right? We really see this as kind of a natural evolution. As utilities start to utilize DLR in day-to-day operations, they will start to have a much better understanding of its use cases, of its benefits, when it can play a role, when it can't play a role, when utilities can have, even though it's not necessarily firm capacity, you are correct, when they can have sufficient enough confidence that they will have that capacity that they can actually use it in planning. So we really think this is the type of thing that will come over time. Second, I'll note that FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has acknowledged that DLR does have a benefit in planning. As I highlighted on that last slide, they are now requiring that in long-term regional transmission planning, DLR must be explored as a potential option. And so that came out of Order 1920. And so FERC is clearly recognizing that DLR does have a role to play within the planning space. And the final explanation I'll give as to kind of the utility hesitancy we'll see, or we do see, I'll highlight a historical example. Once upon a time, solar energy and wind energy and more recently batteries were crazy. No one had done it. Utilities weren't utilizing it. It wasn't included in operations, and it definitely wasn't included in planning. Now, the vast majority of states, certainly Colorado, has an integrated resource planning process. I think it might be called an ERP in Colorado. I might be mistaken.
IRP.
It is IRP in Colorado. Okay, great. There's a different state that calls it an ERP, and I'm forgetting which one that is. But you know, we're now at a place where resource planning, planning for solar, planning for batteries, planning for wind, these are all standard utility practices. They pretty much all do IRPs. Colorado does IRPs, and solar's not firm. Sun's not shining 24 hours a day. We don't know cloud cover, you know, tomorrow or in a week, which days will be sunnier than others and what the, you know, a solar facility's production is going to look like. But utilities have figured out how to model it in planning and how to utilize that to inform their resource portfolio. So it just came down to experience when it came to figuring out how to model solar and wind, right? Over time, utilities got comfortable with the process, figured out how it could be utilized, and now we see these technologies fully captured in planning today. And we would argue that it's going to be no different for the transmission planning approach. But first, in order to get there, we need utilities to start buying it, incorporating it into their day-to-day operations. And once they get comfortable with that, understand how it can be used, then we'll start to see utilities get comfortable with DLR and planning.
Okay, great. Let's see, no other questions from the crowd. I have a couple of questions. So, okay, which one? Actually, let's go into that. I was really interested when you talked about the incentive structure that you say will make utilities want to get after it, but it'll have to definitely benefit ratepayers. Can you go into some detail on what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate the question. Incentives is a world that I come from, and so always very interested to talk about it. So, you know, at a high level, and I won't bore folks with this, but you know, most folks on this call are probably relatively familiar with how utilities make money. It's not a traditional profit and loss model. For every dollar they spend on infrastructure, they make a predetermined, state-approved rate of return. On average, it ranges from 9 to 10%. Call it 10% for simple math. Utilities know what they can get a 10% rate of return on. They have been doing it for years. Transmission investments, have been the case for decades, oftentimes centuries. And utilities are well versed in general rate cases and ensuring they get cost recovery for those investments. Historically, they know they've gotten cost recovery for those investments. So there is no harm in a utility proposing new transmission investments. They know they're going to get those costs recovered and they're going to get their 10% rate of return on them. Utilities are historically more hesitant to use new technologies because they are less certain of their use cases. They're less certain that their regulator is going to approve the costs associated with those technologies. And therefore, there's a little bit of an inherent kind of bias against using any type of new technology. And so that is where the idea of an incentive comes in. So, if under today's rate making approach, if the utility was going to go to its shareholders and say, hey, we can do this $1 billion upgrade and we can make 10% off of it, or we can do this $10 million GETS project and make 10% off of that, the utility is typically going to prefer making the $100 million over making the $1 million in those two instances. And so kind of that's where the idea of carrots and sticks come in. I think both have a role to play. FERC right now is exploring sticks requirements, but carrots are also a very interesting approach. The UK specifically has a shared savings mechanism for dynamic line ratings, whereby if a utility deploys dynamic line ratings on their system and they realize congestion benefits, so that comes through in terms of reduced costs on your bill, if if they can clearly quantify the reduction of the congestion costs, and half of that in the way that it's structured in the UK is basically half of that money goes back to electricity customers by way of reduced bills. The other half of that money flows to the utility because they made the grid more affordable, they reduced costs for their customers, and therefore they were able to earn an adder, earn an incentive on top of their traditional rate base. And in that case, it was 50% of the reduction in congestion. And so when I call it a win-win-win, it's an example where customers got cheaper electricity, so your bills were cheaper. The utility realized more flexibility on the grid by deploying DLR, and the utility was able to earn an incentive. Now, to be clear, the way this is structured in the UK and the way we would ever push for this to be structured in the US is the utility could only earn that incentive under circumstances when they reduce costs for customers. If a utility was deemed to have not reduced costs, then there would be no incentive and they wouldn't get that adder. So, the incentive kind of has this, we'll call it like a stopgap mechanism that ensures that ratepayers benefit. And utilities only realize a financial benefit if their customers also benefit. And if the customers don't benefit, then the utility does not get that benefit. So it kind of really truly incentivized the utilities to not just deploy the technology, but figure out how to use it best in their operations so they can truly reduce congestion, reducing cost to customers.
Okay, I've got a follow-up on that, and it kind of goes to I think the concept used to be kind of referred to more as decoupling in the industry, and I'm thinking more of the comparison to the breakup of AT&T, where long haul transmission data movement, became a separate entity. It was not, it didn't fall under that model, and therefore it's really about, hey, I get paid for traffic and what I'm able to move across my assets. For people that are more pure play in that space, and I'm thinking this out here, WAPA, I know WAPA moves, of course, hydropower, but WAPA has a pretty big transmission network because of the hydropower. I have to suspect they're doing a lot of movement for wheeling other people's energy around. Do you see groups like WAPA, Bonneville Power Administration, shall we say public transmission being a better opportunity to, or, a place to look to get that would be more, have a better, quicker uptake of the technology of just across all gets?
Yeah, no, it's another great question. We certainly see opportunity in the BPA footprint. Really what it comes down to is who is the owner of the transmission infrastructure. It is the owner of the transmission that is going to be the buyer of our technology. So in most cases, that's the utility. However, in certain cases, like you mentioned, Bonneville, they are the owner of, I think it's like 75% of the transmission infrastructure in the Pacific Northwest they own. And so, I will admit, I don't know to what extent WAPA is actually the owner of some of their infrastructure, if they're just kind of like operating on behalf of others who actually own the infrastructure. That's kind of what it would come down to. But, in terms of being an owner, the bigger the owner, the bigger the opportunity. So BPA, Bonneville, represents a huge opportunity because they own a ton of infrastructure in the Pacific Northwest, and they also operate a ton of really cheap hydropower that if they can push more hydropower instead of more costly, dirtier energy to their customers, that's going to really significantly reduce costs. BPA is a particularly tough entity to work with, and they are not really regulated by anyone. They're technically regulated by the Department of Energy, but pretty softly, and therefore, there's not really anyone who can kind of tell BPA what to do. And so what where we really see kind of the big opportunity is with entities like that, if they can be convinced to actually deploy the technology, but really with utilities and with RTOs and ISOs who have an incentive to help the utilities within their footprint do more and better coordinated regional and interregional planning. And if we really see an uptick with RTOs and ISOs being willing to factor in DLR into their planning, that can have kind of a really big future effect to then the utilities in those footprints understanding how and under what circumstance DLR can be used and where they should focus on deploying it.
Okay, great. Here's another question. Any comments on the example in Montana's GETS/ATTS incentive mechanism? Would that potentially work in Colorado?
Yeah, you know what? I don't have it pulled up right now, but I'm going to do an incredibly quick search because I do think I know a little bit about that legislation. It is focused on advanced conductors. And sorry, I'm just pulling it up right now. I think it enables the state's PUC to approve cost effectiveness criteria for advanced conductors. And so I'm less familiar with if there's a separate incentive mechanism. I would be curious to understand if there is a separate incentive mechanism. However, with regard to the cost effectiveness criteria, which is in that bill, that is absolutely something that we would advocate for. In my previous life, I worked, I mentioned this at the beginning of the call, I worked at utility Southern California Edison, and there was something that we worked on called the avoided cost calculator, which is essentially, it's a cost benefits assessment, CBA. And one thing that I have very much come to learn with CBAs is they can be structured in a number of ways, and whoever is the one structuring the CBA can either do it in a way that truly incorporates all benefits and all costs, or they can pick and choose which benefits and costs are incorporated. And so, yeah, I certainly encourage any type of cost benefit criteria, cost effectiveness criteria, CBA, whatever you want to call it, that really specifically delineates what are the benefits and costs that should be included. Because otherwise, if it is left up to the utility, for example, they can pick and choose which benefits and costs to factor in, and that can result in, let's just say a not level playing field for all types of technologies, if that makes sense. But I am curious if the person who had the comment is aware of a separate incentive mechanism. I would be curious to learn more about that, and I'm happy to get into that and follow up.
Great. Well, James, if you want to email me, I can connect you with Eli on that if you have that information. And then a follow-up, let's see, or can you say anything about the Excel DLR pilot project that you're working on, the nature of the project, preliminary results, if you're able to disclose that?
Yeah, I am able to share a little bit. So LineVision does indeed have a project with Excel. Let me try to see what I remember about it. I believe we're deployed on 3 lines with Excel. We've seen a capacity gain, I think, on all 3 lines. I want to say the line with, I think the biggest gain was an average of a 36% capacity gain on that line. Again, as I mentioned, it's not firm, so sometimes below that, sometimes above that, but on average across the year, 36%. So we've seen really positive results with our pilot in Colorado. I know they are still continuing to study those lines. I believe in Colorado, Excel has also selected a couple of other DLR vendors as, I think it's part of that project. It might be kind of separate projects, but the idea is to kind of do a comparison of the various technologies, and fingers crossed, the assumption, or at least my assumption or my hopeful assumption, is that assuming they do indeed realize significant benefits through these technologies and evaluate them and determine which is the best, that they would seek to do a broader deployment within their footprint. But as I also mentioned, we're hopeful to see some additional areas in Colorado that could result in DLR deployment, namely, CETA, further refining that study that I talked about, and then also if the legislature, and I know their session begins in January, if they also explore other advanced transmission technology or GETS legislation. Those are a couple other areas we could kind of really see Colorado continue to make a dent in the GET space. But yeah, that's a very high level overview of kind of what we have with Excel. Again, the main benefit is capacity relief, and which they did indeed realize with each of our deployments.
Okay, I'm just the question from before, we'll get you connected, but he mentioned that CETA did not do a CBA and just accepted Colorado's ERPs using least cost, and ERP is what CETA referred to them in the study, not IRPs. So yeah, that came from the CETA study where you got that. But I do have, just backing up to the question on your pilot projects, by any chance, does that involve the line going into the San Luis Valley? Because I know that's a huge pain point because it has one of the best solar resources and it's really cool and cold. So the solar really works well. And the billionaire won't allow the line to go over the other pass to create a proper circle route. So
yeah, I've heard a little bit about this issue. I'm not intimately familiar with it. I want to say no. I believe our lines are in the Denver metro area, so I assume that would be a different area. I guess I don't know for a fact that all 3 of our lines are in that area. I know at least one is, but I want to say all 3 are in that area, because there are also, my understanding is, constraints coming out of the Denver metro area. I was doing a little bit of due diligence on their latest ERP, and we were seeing significant constraints in the Denver metro. And yeah, so I don't think we're on in that specific area that you referenced, San Luis.
okay, yeah, it's out in southern Colorado. Okay, we'll give it a second here, and I have a follow-up. You mentioned the ability to kind of rapidly actually, get the project done. But do you see problems in terms of your permitting lead time, or is permitting relatively, obviously new stuff is crazy permitting, but when you're just doing, in essence, an add-on to an existing line, what does that look like?
Yeah, no issues with that at all. So because we're installing directly on the towers, that means the utility or the transmission owner, whoever it may be, already has secured the right of way for that tower, meaning no additional permitting needs to occur. And then, in the case of new construction, where they do need to go and secure permits, installing our devices wouldn't change that at all. The time it takes to secure a permit can be a long time, but that would not be a result of our device. So there's no additional permitting that needs to happen. Kind of really the pieces that get you to that. It's when we say 3 months to deploy, we can stick a device on a tower in 30 minutes. It's much faster than 3 months. It does not take 3 months to do that, but it takes kind of 3 months so we put the device up, but then for it to be fully operational, feeding data, and it does, what's the term? It does something called forecast training. So basically the data that we're feeding to the utility, it's gathering information from the conductor, and it is training a forecast model to continuously improve. And so it takes about 3 months to feed data to that forecast training model for it to be, fully effective and giving you real legitimate dynamic line ratings. So yeah, no permitting issues though, which is great.
Okay. Well, I have one more that, in terms of the broader industry of GETs, if we really see this kind of take off, if we see the right environment and demand really picks up quickly, is it relatively easy to scale this? I mean, it's obviously software is easy to scale, but across the broad board, and obviously, if you don't, would there be an issue of like, oh, wow, well, we can't produce our module fast enough because it's got a proprietary semiconductor, something like that. Do you see an issue with that, or is this something that could kind of deploy pretty rapidly? And obviously the utility industry is going to be a bit slow until they see it work, but it could take off.
Yeah, this is another great question. For the most part, I don't really see some huge hurdles. The technology itself is very commercially available. There are a number of providers. I would say LineVision is kind of one of 3 leading providers in the US for DLR, but there's many other dozens, maybe hundreds, probably dozens of other DLR providers who are ready to implement at scale. And so I think with a pretty good sized market already, and the fact that it's not, I guess theoretically, if every single utility came to us tomorrow and said, we want to deploy your system on our grid immediately, no, we could not do that. But that's not realistic. And what would be more realistic is you would see utilities start to kind of slowly scale up. And so as long as you can kind of foresee some of that pattern happening, utilities across the US slowly scaling up within their own footprints, which is the typical way you kind of see technologies like this deployed, there's no reason to see an issue with really realizing full scale. In terms of DLR deployment.
Okay, well, looks like there's no other questions. Eli, I want to thank you again for joining us tonight. It was a great presentation and sounds like an exciting area to help us address the very large transmission challenge that we have. And as you mentioned, it's going to take everything from every direction, especially if we start getting through the interconnection queue and really start getting all this stuff that's in the pipeline online. Well, everyone, I want to thank you as well. You will get an email tomorrow once the video processes, and then we'll get this edited and out on the YouTube channel too. If you have questions, feel free to email me either at the info@CRES or p.eberle@cres-energy.org. So Eli, thanks again, and everyone have a great evening.
Thank you.